Good day. I want to thank you for tuning in, I guess is the right phrase, to another podcast or video. Finding it either on Facebook, on YouTube, or on my website. I'm just glad you found it and are interested in sharing with me my reflections on various things. Just before I got ready to do this, I received word from Phyllis Lilly about the passing of the Most Reverend Gene Lilly, Bishop Gene, as most of us knew him, who went to be with the Lord Jesus just last evening at 9:30. And we're all, those of us who knew him well, are still a little grieving and mourning the passing of this great man, even though we suspected it was coming soon. Bishop Gene touched the lives of thousands of people around the world. I had the privilege of ministering with him over 35 years, which is hard to believe, and we ministered in Asia and Europe, and then in the United States. And so I'm grieving the loss of my friend and my brother, and yet rejoicing that he's with the Lord. In the American news, if you follow the American news, there's a story of a young man, 15 years old, named Ethan, who entered into his high school in Oxford, Michigan, which for you, that's a secondary school for those from other countries. And he entered with a pistol, allegedly given to him by his parents as a birthday present. And he opened fire on his classmates. 4 of those classmates died immediately, ages 14 to 17. And there are 6 others who are still in the hospital, also ages 14 to 17, and then 1 teacher, and those in the hospital are expected to recover. When we hear about this story, of course, our hearts first go out to the parents, the brothers and sisters, the grandparents, the victims of this violence. Our hearts go out to the town where this happened. And it's often the cases in these situations of school violence, the towns are small towns. If I'm correct, Oxford, Michigan has a population of around 10,000 people, which means people know each other. These students would have been known by folks in the town, and the families would be known. And as much as the town will join and grieve together with those 4 families, and I'm sure they will, they held a candlelight service shortly after the event, and the entire town, it looked like the entire town was out. It's the 4 families who lost forever a child or a grandchild that hurt the most. Their lives will never be the same. This loss will appear on Christmas season, and it'll be there every Christmas season for the rest of their lives. And even though the pain will get below the surface and life will go on, it'll still be there. And the fact is, this whole case, this whole story is that a 15-year-old young man did this. And this young man, who is said to have committed this senseless murders, is under arrest in jail and most likely will be sentenced to life in prison. I don't have inside information, and I can only respond to what is being reported in the American newspapers, the media. And it's always dangerous. I try to warn people of this. It's always dangerous to respond to these situations, especially immediately, because more information comes out later. And I'm not sure what the American judicial system will do. It's not a perfect system, and like all systems known to man, it's in need of constant reform. And the truth is, the American judicial system does reform itself constantly. But at the heart of the system is the belief, it's the heart of belief of the American system, it's the belief that whoever is brought before the courts is presumed innocent. They're not guilty and have to prove their innocence. Their innocence, and the state has to prove that they're guilty. And it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and the decision is going to be made not by the judge, not by the lawyers, but by a jury. It's the responsibility, it's not the responsibility, get that again, of an innocent person to prove that they're innocent. And so this young man has pleaded that he's not guilty, even though there's a host of evidence. Now, in addition to the boy being under arrest, this 15-year-old, both his parents are under arrest as accomplices to the murder, or should I say alleged accomplices. Apparently, they are being accused of supplying the gun to the young man. The father is being accused of purchasing the gun just 4 days earlier and giving it to this young man as a birthday present. The mother is being accused of actually going to a gun range to teach this boy how to correctly and safely use the weapon. In addition, the parents are being accused of knowing that this young man had intentions of violence, or at least thoughts of extreme violence, and they did nothing. And the school administration, which also had indications of this young man being mentally troubled and having thoughts of violence, did nothing. This makes my heart so sad, because I believe here we had a troubled young man. My clinical experience would say he was most likely schizophrenic or pre-schizophrenic. He was screaming for help, even talked about hearing voices, and no one gave him that help. Now, I understand that's a big assumption on my part. It reminds me of the case in Connecticut several years ago where, again, a young man who was clearly suffering from mental and emotional problems entered into an elementary school and murdered young children and teachers. Once again, the mother had knowledge of the young man's emotional and psychological problems, and she had a house full of weapons. The automatic weapons that he used belonged to his mother. And he committed that crime shortly after his father, who had abandoned him, married another woman. These incidents, these horrific and evil incidents, raise lots of questions for the citizenry of the United States and perhaps around the world. This thing will enter into the political realm. It'll become political. It already has come political. And there'll be all kinds of political positions taken and many times used for their own political advantage. There'll be talks of law and order. And there needs to be more protection. Perhaps I heard someone talk about having metal detectors in all our schools. And as sad as that is, we might need that increased security. And I certainly believe there's a need for all of us to call for better mental health services to not only young people, but to all those who suffer from mental illness or emotional problems, which is the case of most homeless people and many of those who are drug addicted. Again, I don't want to predict what will happen. Will a jury convict this young man? Will the young man be found innocent by reasons of insanity? Or will he even be able to stand trial because of his mental health issues? What about the parents? There have been many cases where parents have been found guilty of being an accomplice. The suffering of the parents will be burned forever. Suffering of the parents of the victims, and perhaps the suffering of the parents of Ethan, will be burned forever in the memory of the town of Oxford, and particularly that high school. Like I said, there'll be calls for gun control, and there will be those who will fight for the constitutional rights of citizens to bear arms or own guns. Some arguments will make sense on both sides of the issue. And of course, some will be ridiculous. And then there'll be the media, both right and left, who will give those extremes and those radical voices a forum. Who wouldn't want to solve the problem of school violence where our children are murdered or harmed? Who wouldn't want to solve the problem of young men dying from gun violence every day, and especially on the weekends in our cities, gang violence? But beyond being America, there's violence around the world. And we need to reflect on that. There's particularly tribal violence in places like Afghanistan or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the Sudan that are going on even as I'm speaking. And they get no voice in the Western press. Who wouldn't want to make sure that the horror of Nazi Germany and the genocide of 6 million Jews never repeats itself? And yet, the evil of that Nazi mindset is very real in the concentration camps of China, not far from where the Olympic Games will be held. China, however, complicates this because it's in financial bed with the United States and Europe, being a major producer of the batteries for solar panels and solar panels themselves, as well as batteries for electric cars, which are being pushed by the American government and the climate control advocates. China exports lots of stuff to the West via cheap slave labor. Many of the clothes that are worn or shoes that are purchased by Westerners have a label in the back that says made in China, as well as many of the plastic products are made in China. And most of our medications that are taken by Westerners are produced in China. I could go on and on. I listened the other day to a great reflection by Father Kenneth Tanner, a CEC priest in Rochester, Michigan, on the events of the school shooting that day. It was excellent. It was an excellent call reminding us that the light is greater than the darkness. Father Kenneth was, if I understand correctly, at the school after the shooting and was given the grace to minister to the families of the victims as well as other families gathered there, standing around in fear until they heard about their child. I don't even want to imagine that with my children or my grandchildren ever having to face that. And I thank God that I never have. I'm also sure there will be ministry needed for all those children who survived or escaped, and for the teachers who have to go back and teach. I just heard recently that the school is closed until after the first of the year. And I know Father Kenneth will be very much involved in that because of his pastoral heart and his compassion. The events like these, all these events from Columbine to Sandy Hook, or an event in northern Kenya where Islamic extremists killed all the Christians at a local school, or the children in Rwanda who less than 20 years ago watched their Tutsi classmate die from being hacked to death with a machete by their Hutu neighbors. All of these events will be defining moments the same way the survivors of Auschwitz carried to their grave the memory of the Nazi horrors. I was a pastor on Long Island until recently with a church just 20 miles from Ground Zero, the site of the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11, 2021. It was a defining moment for the United States of America, especially for those of us who were alive during that event. I could watch the burning of the towers and witness the collapse of the buildings from my balcony at my house. The first few days after the attack, like most Americans, I lived with a surreal emotional experience of what had happened. I heard the lack of noise, the silence of the skies as all the planes were grounded. The exception would be a military helicopter, and it would break that silence and everybody would look up, or a fighter jet would go by. I looked out my window day after day at the ocean where usually there was an endless horizon, but now there are actually ships of war. Though many clergy went down to Ground Zero right away, I decided to stay behind and to minister to the people at my church. and to my neighbors. Most of the people who died at Ground Zero, including the police and firefighters, lived in the suburbs of New York or New Jersey, places like where I ministered on Long Island. We also, and my church had many people who worked in the city or in the financial district who experienced firsthand the collapse of the towers and survived that horror. My own daughter went down, who worked at Outback, went down right after with all the employees of her restaurant where she worked. And there they were feeding the policemen and firefighters and the folks were medical personnel. I remember her coming home with the gray dust of Ground Zero all over her shoes, her clothes, and in her hair. And I know that that event has formed her as a person to this day. She's talked about it and shared it, usually as the event comes close. I actually went down several days later, the following Monday, and each day that week. The violence that happened there is still very real for me. I can image it. I pray it always will be in my memory, and that memory will give tribute to those who died. But the real impact on me was the faces and the lives of people who were there to do the rescue. They were driven and focused, but they were also stunned and distressed, seeking, like the rest of America and the world, an answer. But the seeking for them, like I'm sure at Ground Zero in Oxford, Michigan, at the school shooting, or at other locations of horror like Sandy Hook or that small town in Texas where someone entered a church and shot parishioners. That distress, that seeking continues. I came away with a sense of being incredibly blessed to be among the first responders and by the opportunity to pray for them or merely say words of encouragement, to speak love and light in the midst of hatred and the demonic darkness of evil. But I left with an understanding of evangelism or ministry that was much different than when I first went down to Ground Zero. It really occurred to me, and I think to people like Father Tanner, that the call of being a bearer of the light of Christ as a messenger of love and hope and of Christ Jesus himself is far greater than the darkness that surrounds us as we bring that message. That Jesus himself is the one who gives light in the midst of darkness, the one who defeats evil. And the call is not to bring men and women to Christ to ensure salvation, but to bring Christ, the light, the hope, the life to men and women who are in the midst of the darkness and hopelessness that evil tries to inflict upon us. And then to let Christ Jesus himself draw them to his humanity and his participation in their lives at that moment. And in that, there is healing. I will continue to pray for those who have been so intimately touched by the Michigan violence, particularly those who are doing ministry. Our souls are so sensitive and fragile. I will pray for my brother who is called to minister there, and to all the pastors throughout that area who were called or will be called to go in the midst of darkness to bring the light, in the midst of hatred to bring love, to midst of brokenness to bring healing, that healing love of God that is present with us always. This has been a long reflection to get what ultimately is happening in me about this event. I don't have the answers to the question of evil or to the reality of such horrible suffering, to the issue of violence among us, things like war. I pray for politicians whose job it is to lead us through all of this with their political solutions. My understanding is only that evil and violence, hatred and death will be among us until the day comes when he, Jesus, comes in glory and the kingdom is established fully on earth as it is in heaven. And given that reality, it is to live now in the truth that Jesus is with us at ground zero and at the Oxford High School in Michigan, in the midst of the Congo, and in the concentration camps in China. He draws us to live in the truth that that darkness, whatever it is that's around us, is not greater than the light that is in us. Love is greater than hate. It is eternal, and it is love, not hatred, that will endure forever. This season of Advent and Christmas, hard to believe that Christmas is just a few days away. The Nativity, the Incarnation, says, look at the darkness of that time, at the birth of Jesus, the poverty, the violence, the oppression. And God comes into our humanity as an embryo, as an infant, as a toddler. Finally, as one who will die his death at the hands of our evil and violence, to defeat it, to defeat death as the controlling force, and put into place the life of resurrection love that the Bible tells us holds the entire universe together. That which was made for him and by him is held together by him for all eternity. God bless you.